A couple of months ago, I subscribed to the Video Game History Foundation's monthly vintage gaming magazine delivery service, where they'll send you a magazine chosen at random from a wide variety of publications and eras. Looking back through these old magazines is a blast, and while I wholeheartedly recommend subscribing to this for yourself, there's one element of the nostalgia hit that's missing. Where's the demo disc? While archivists are out there doing the Lord's work of ISO-izing and zip filing many of these shiny round relics, it's a real shame that we can't pop in a disc full of exciting new and upcoming experiences in the modern era. Or can we? A few times a year, Valve hosts the Steam Next Fest, a week-long digital celebration of upcoming games in the form of piles upon piles of demos. Steam's recommendation systems do a decent enough job of showing you things you may enjoy, but the reality is, there's just way too much here for a normal, well-adjusted human to sift through in just a week. But I'm no normal human, and I'm far from well-adjusted, so I'm here to once again bring you the Next Fest demo disc, a curated collection of demos from a variety of genres, art styles, and playstyles. I've played over 50 demos over the last couple days, and while I wish I could tell you about every single one, I've managed to narrow it down to 9 demos that I think you need to know about, presented in alphabetical order. So free up some hard drive space and get that wishlisting finger prepped, cause it's time to pop in the Next Fest demo disc. Back in Next Fest Volume 2, we covered a demo for a little poker-themed deck builder that's since blown up in a big way. Post-full game release, John Balatro has recommended a few games here and there on his Twitter, and he hasn't missed the mark yet. Dungeons and Degenerate Gamblers released back in August, and I've been loving Battling Rats and Necromancers in its chaotic take on Blackjack. Star Vaders is another deck builder, though this time with an Advance Wars-like art style and grid-based mech battles. But today I want to talk about Ballionaire, the pachinko roguelike. Ballionaire tasked the player with dropping a set number of pachinko balls to reach a minimum dollar amount per round, flavorized here as tributes to various gods. Unlike some of the aforementioned games, rather than building a deck of cards, you'll be selecting from a randomly assigned selection of 3 triggers to place on the board after each ball drop. Each little dude you place between the standard pegs can have a variety of properties and effects. Some are simple enough, granting money each time they're passed through. Others will spawn more balls of different types, move your balls from place to place, or even spawn additional triggers around themselves. While most triggers can be passed through by the ball, obstacle triggers cannot. This allows you to create a rough path for the balls to take that lets your triggers synergize together in a more efficient way. It takes a few rounds to come to grips with, but once you gain some familiarity with all of these synergies, it's possible to push the board into an explosion of colorful chaos. There's a somewhat similar game, Peglin, released a few months ago, that I do enjoy, but its art style is a bit drab. You never really get that hypersensory dopamine hit like you'd want out of a pachinko-inspired game. Ballionaire's artwork, though, is fully candy-coated, with plenty of effects and visuals to enjoy, sped up or slowed down as you like. I also enjoy that 90% of these little guys look pretty high. I think there's probably only so long before these number go up roguelike slot machine games become tired, and maybe you've already reached that point. But for me, Ballionaire is a fun enough twist on the formula that I'm excited to drop back into when it releases in full. In choosing games to cover for this series, I try to pick things that I think are flying under most people's radar. Like Windblown is really cool, and I'm stoked for that game, but you'll probably see or hear about it given its developer's previous work and its place on the Steam charts. Butcher's Creek is the latest project from David Zemansky, whose games likely need no introduction. Dusk arguably kickstarted the current retro FPS renaissance, and Iron Lung is, probably, getting a live-action film produced by Markiplier. Hell, even his relatively small games like Chop Goblins or Squirrel Stapler have thousands of positive Steam reviews. I'm not sure what will happen with Butcher's Creek though, because this game is evil. Evoking games like Manhunt and Condemned, Butcher's Creek puts the player in the shoes of a real sicko freak on the hunt for twisted videotapes within the titular abandoned small town. A real-life lost media hunter, you could say. But it's not long before the gravity of what's happening here starts to sink in, and before we can tuck tail and turn home, we are caught and imprisoned deep within a cultist-infested compound whose vague but nefarious intentions will force us to fight our way out. I've discussed my mixed feelings on the whole VHS aesthetic in video games before on this channel, but I have to say this game is probably the most convincing implementation of it that I've ever seen. This opening area is dripping in atmosphere. A still forest occasionally disrupted by the light and sound of a lone car passing along the nearby country road. The sewers below are nightmarish. If you took a low-res screen grab down here and told me it was from a found-footage horror movie, I'd probably believe you. Alright, well, maybe I'm misrepresenting the game a bit here, because in typical Dave Zemansky style, this game is also quite silly. Like Condemned, the melee combat here is brutal, messy, and deadly. Unlike Condemned, we can slap our bare-ass foot across barrels, projecting them into enemies for a quick stun. Healing our little tape-hungry gorehound is accomplished by using a Polaroid camera to take photos of the many murder scenes you encounter in your escape attempt, granting more health the more gruesome the picture, along with some pretty amusing text to go with it.
Wow, even better than mother!
Snuff tapes can be found throughout the compound, some in plain sight and some hidden, allowing you to open special tape-consuming doors to rooms full of supplies and weapons, and are additionally used to save the game at the cost of 1 tape per save, meaning you'll have to weigh the pros and cons of where and when to spend your tapes. Overall, I had a great time soaking in Butcher's Creek's impeccably ghoulish atmosphere and thematically appropriate, mildly frustrating combat, and I can't wait to delve into the depths of this silly, evil little game. Going into each Next Fest, my greatest hope is always to find something completely unassuming that ends up blowing me away. Finding demos to try is a whole process in and of itself, and I'm constantly wishlisting and jotting down suggestions from a multitude of sources. But sometimes you just have to get deep into the Steam mines and dig. Dead Wells, the Devil Fragment, is absolutely the hidden gem for this episode, and I'm very excited to share it with you. I have to admit, I found Dead Wells in an exhausted state many hours deep into the production of this video, and this shockingly crushed audio in the intro cutscene
on the first day, the burning devil scarred the skies.
Was almost enough to knock me into the abyss. But I'm glad I persisted because this is one of the most interesting games I've played this year, period. Dead Wells begins with character creation, allowing you to pick from one of 4 classes, presented in these cool rotating dioramas.
Wayward Knight, Sewer Rat, Devil Hunter, Dusty Gunslinger, Bloody the Seeker.
Typos aside, there's some pretty wild stuff here, right? Like Rat Buster, a mesh metal crate trap ready to burst from the bloodthirsty rats writhing inside. I guess we'll choose that one. To get the obvious bit out of the way, the game is not particularly shy about its influences. The UI and much of the combat and leveling mechanics feel directly lifted from games like Kingsfield and Dark Souls. Even the way that characters stand. But Dead Wells is absolutely doing its own thing here as well. For starters, outside of the standard big sword-swinging, dodging, parrying, and stamina managing, Dead Wells has what it calls the Falter system. Attacking enemies depletes a yellow bar below their health and, once depleted, allows you to juggle enemies further and further into the air. If you manage to send them high enough to hit the ceiling, they'll take damage from the impact before crashing to the ground, where they'll take even more. It seems a little silly at first, but it's genuinely thrilling blasting skeletons skyward and watching them burst into bones when they hit the floor. This ain't exactly Devil May Cry though, as even with a faster weapon like the flail, everything still moves quite slowly. It's a strange mix of ideas, but it really worked for me. Additionally, you can find Castlevania-style sub-weapons with abilities ranging from relatively straightforward ice bombs to the aforementioned Rat Buster that I still don't know what it actually does. Actually, speaking of Castlevania, if I had to compare it to one more game, it would probably be Castlevania 64. With its low poly, blurry, textured look, it certainly does evoke that particular 64-bit console, especially in these foggy, castle-adjacent nighttime portions. Maybe it's an acquired taste, but I think the game looks legitimately great most of the time. Despite having access to horses from the start, this is also less of an open-ended Soulsborne-type world and more of a linear adventure like you'd find on the N64, right down to the platforming and puzzle solving. That being said, it's probably relatively clear from the footage you've seen so far that this isn't exactly a well-polished hidden gem. I don't think I've played a game with more typos in my life, and I did run across some unfortunate bugs. My character's run speed would plummet after interacting with certain things, like the game's bonfire equivalent soup cauldron, though a quick dodge roll would fix it. This boss cutscene is incredible. But after trying to skip it for my second attempt, the cutscene continued playing while the boss and I were fighting blindly in the background. But here's the thing. Aside from some of these small issues that are obviously just errors, I wouldn't change much of anything about Dead Wells. The goofy-ass horses, the sometimes baffling sub-weapons, the bizarrely directed cutscenes, all these elements that others might call janky, I'd call delightfully quirky. Really, the only thing I truly dislike is the weird color-coded enemy attack system. It's just too hard to remember what each type of attack does in the moment, and even when you do, it doesn't really add anything to the experience. Each weapon already has its own version of parry or block and a charge attack, so it just doesn't really feel like it needs this last extra layer on top. Let me tell you, it's some wild whiplash to go from nearly Alt F4ing out of a game in the intro cutscene to being in love with it in the span of an hour and a half. I don't know where else to put this, but seemingly every single enemy in the game has an elaborate fatality-style cutscene that plays out if you get killed by them. It owns. Someone needs to get this game on Iron Pineapple's radar or something, because I would really love for it to get the attention and support it deserves. But hopefully I've done the game justice here enough to get some eyes on it. Eagerly awaiting the full release of this one, and I'll be finishing the demo as soon as this video goes up. Despite enjoying many of From Software's games over the years, I've never really gotten around to putting much time into the Kingsfield series. I quite enjoyed last year's Lunacid, a game heavily inspired by it, but it ended up losing my attention at some point for a reason I can't quite pinpoint. This is probably a little early to say, but the demo for our next game, Hark the Ghoul, has me absolutely hooked to the point that I'd be quite surprised if I didn't end up playing it in its entirety. Hark begins with an important question: just what kind of bug are you? After choosing a bug and a name, you awake, as is the way with these games, in a dark room with nothing to guide you but your wits. Well, your wits and your foot. Though we'll soon find a sword made of bone, this is somehow the second game of this video featuring kick-heavy gameplay. You'll be able to do not only a surprisingly large amount of damage with said kicks, but you'll also be solving jumping puzzles with them as well. Like Kingsfield, you'll face off against enemies with relatively simple melee combat, but the rhythm of going in for a few hits, backing off, and going back in is surprisingly compelling. There's an interesting magic system here too, with spells that seem to provide utility more so than damage, at least here in the demo. Lightstone, for example, creates a small light-emitting boulder that you can kick around to brighten dark spaces or kick into enemies to damage them. It's got more flavor than just handing you a torch or whatever. I like it. There's a moment pretty early on where I broke open one of those bug cocoons and found a skeleton inside, seemingly implying that these grub ghouls we've been fighting used to be human. The demo's full of stuff like this, and as much as environmental storytelling as a phrase gets kind of memed on, it is genuinely cool to come across something like this in a game that's so willing to withhold information from you, giving you the feeling that you put it together. Eventually we do manage to leave the larva-infested cave system, and the game starts taking its visual cues from a certain other FromSoft game. Guns, Victorian city streets, and angry people yelling at you behind locked front doors aside though, Hark really solidifies its own unique personality here. Despite the game's sometimes surprisingly creepy moments, the characters you meet are typically quite cheerful and kind towards you. We've got Emil, a boy who will sell you his ill-gotten goods if you have the coin. There's Lepidor, the adorable moth person who will help you level up your stats in exchange for experience. And Watson, who's a dog. As you may expect, you'll be able to find more people throughout the city and add them to your little gathering of misfits if you're willing to help them out. It probably goes without saying, but the vibes here are immaculate. Between the foggy city street environments punctuated by splashes of amber and the melancholy music, I regularly found myself stopping just to take it all in. There's plenty of games out there going for the PS1 warbly, unfiltered texture look, but I gotta say, other than the UI elements, this one has it down pretty well. This is probably done for legibility reasons, but I would love to see an option to match the UI to the lower res visuals. Hark the Ghoul is really something special, and I absolutely cannot wait to play the full game next year. I really debated whether or not to include Heroes of Hammerwatch 2 on this list, not because I don't think the game is good, I think it's excellent. But I feel like everyone is kinda aware of these games to some degree. It's a confusing series because you have Hammerwatch 1 and 2, which are mostly straightforward gauntlet-like games, and then you have Heroes of Hammerwatch, which is kind of the same, but with a more roguelike structure. I was surprised to see the demo for this game in the Next Fest list, like, haven't I already played this? These games also have a bit of a mixed reputation, and for me personally, despite being a massive enjoyer of basically any kind of top-down action RPG, none of these entries in the series have held my attention for very long. But I'm really liking Heroes of Hammerwatch 2, and I'm just going to try to do my best to explain why I think you should give this game a go even if the others didn't click for you. For starters, this game is gorgeous. While I think Heroes 1 is a nice, cute-looking game, 2 is a massive step up. With ridiculously densely packed forests, full of foliage that sways in the breeze, and dank dungeons growing mushrooms and moss amongst piles of bones left by goblins. It's just a very crunchy game in a way that a lot of my favorite early 2000s ARPGs were. As you'd expect, the game opens with character creation, allowing you to choose between 3 classes: Paladin, Ranger, and Wizard. Not exactly a unique selection, but each feels distinct enough, especially after gaining some levels and skills. After some brief tutorializing, we rescue a group of villagers from cultists, and this is where things get interesting. I get the sense that there's a growing exhaustion for games tagged in the roguelike genre. I'm not among that number, but if you are, hear me out on this one, because Heroes 2 has actually struck a really interesting middle ground between standard and rogue-style progression. While out questing, you'll find a few different types of loot. Trinkets provide passive benefits and grant more for collecting other pieces in their given set. There's also these purple skill orbs that grant new effects to your existing skills, often changing how you utilize them. Both of these upgrades exist only on a per-run basis, but other equipment like weapons and armor, you'll keep as long as you choose to. While out exploring in the world, you'll additionally find building supplies, which you can then take back to your little village and grow it as you see fit. Construct a blacksmith to buy and sell your equipment, or a magic shop to start future runs with skill modifiers, and watch the city grow along with your character. In terms of the moment-to-moment gameplay, Heroes 2 is just a really solid and fun gauntlet-style hack and slash. Enemies go down quickly individually, but tend to come at you in large groups, and it's very satisfying to dodge roll around and gather them up for a wide AoE attack. There's also just a lot of polish here in terms of controls and user experience. The game runs great on Steam Deck and plays just as well, maybe even a little better, on controller as it does on mouse and keyboard. The UI is fully scalable and customizable, making everything easy to read on a handheld as well. The whole thing can be played in co-op too, and while I didn't get to try it out for this video, it does seem like there's plenty of ways to synergize your abilities with your friends. As much as I do love finding unique experiences like Hark the Ghoul or Dead Wells, I'd be lying if I said I didn't love a standard-ass fantasy action game, and Heroes of Hammerwatch 2 feels like it'll fill that slot for me if the full game is as good as its demo suggests. If I had to pick a personal favorite out of all the 50+ games I tried this next fest, I think it would have to be Mohrta. Its developer, Scumhead, has a very distinctive style to their games, perfectly blending the grotesque and disgusting with the beautiful and cute. I loved their FPS series Lycanthorn and Shrine, and their recent free RPG Franzen was wonderful as well. Mohrta is their new first-person action-adventure game, and is easily their most ambitious work yet. Mohrta takes place in the world of the Great Strange, a place where the supernatural is dangerously commonplace. Here you'll play as one of the Hayward, a living corpse inside a suit of iron, tasked with investigating and removing said supernatural anomalies. Combat in Mohrta is slower and more methodical than you may be expecting from a GZ Doom engine game, in a way that well suits its mood. While ammo is infinite, you'll have to spend mana to use your weapon's alternate fire, which you can replenish through defeating enemies. The whole demo is quite striking, but this opening area in particular really sells the whole Stephen King's The Dark Tower Gunslinger meets SNES era JRPG, but in 3D vibe. But the second location is what really blew me away. This hub area, where you'll upgrade and prepare before missions, is absolutely packed full of unusual and intriguing characters and creatures to a degree that elevates the whole production value far beyond any of Scumhead's prior projects.
Mohrta.
The amount of creativity and character design, even just in this area alone, is seriously unparalleled. I mean, look at all these dudes. It's only uphill from here though, as our bird-like handler sends us off to our next mission in Garden Graves. That aforementioned thematic throughline of intermingling beauty and grotesquerie is everywhere in Mohrta. Skeletons with bound arms chase you on sight, but their bodies are covered in moss and flowers, producing the sounds of jingling, jangling bones you'd expect, but in a softer, more pleasant tone that evokes a wind chime more than anything nefarious. An imposing creature in a big coat who wants nothing more than to eat bones, but also to be just like you, his big bro. In the corner of a cave tucked away, the bodies of an unlikely pairing of monster and human. It's all legitimately beautiful in this understated way that just feels effortless and like it comes from a fully realized, complex world. Even the mechanical aspects of Mohrta feel perfectly in sync with its world in this way. You don't just have a flashlight, you have a light-emitting bat that you can call and recall, who mostly follows you around, but also will occasionally wander around a bit. Garden Grave's cave system is enormous, and rather than just letting you fast travel through a menu, you'll meet an adorably plump, flower-wearing moth who will happily carry you back to the entrance. Later, you'll acquire what is basically the Needler from Halo, but here made of bone, moss, and fungus. It rules. I could seriously gush about this game for an entire video, but instead I'm just going to let this game speak for itself at this point and leave you with two caveats. One is that performance is pretty rough at times in this demo. I can live with some low frame rates, especially in indie titles, but there are times that this game would approach unplayability. But I assume this can and will be fixed before long. The second is that while I found the combat enjoyable, I do think if you go into this without having played other GZ Doom or smaller scale retro FPS games, you may struggle a bit coming to grips with the gameplay. The bosses in particular can be a little finicky. For me, these are minor issues, and Mohrta has unquestionably shot to the top of my most anticipated list, but it may not be for absolutely everyone. If this footage and/or my words on the game interest you though, I cannot recommend enough that you give it a try for yourself. Speaking of games that are incredibly interesting but maybe not for everyone, let's talk about Project Silverfish. Silverfish is the new immersive sim-ish, stalker-ish game from the same solo developer as Adaka, a pretty cool Half-Life 2-like from a couple of years ago. Silverfish puts you in the scaly claws of a character and class of your choosing in a post-apocalyptic world where humanity has gone extinct and been replaced by factions of reptilian humanoids who fight for control of what's left. After a brief tutorial, you'll mostly be left to your own devices, taking jobs and mingling with the few friendly faces around the opening hub area. Silverfish is a game that requires and rewards patience. Ammo, food, healing, and direction are all scarce, and it definitely takes some time to come to grips with the game, especially if you're rusty or unfamiliar with the genre. I accepted my first job, the lowest paying one because I figured it would probably be the easiest, to find and disable a radio jammer in the nearby Crossroads district. Silverfish has a map, but it's essentially just a paper map on the screen, no indicator for yourself or objectives. You'll have to use landmarks, which is cool, IMO. Similarly, mission briefings only offer vague instructions, though you can actually create, add to, or edit any of these entries however you see fit. It's neat. The decisions come hard and fast. Do you leave during the day, when you'll be able to spot enemies easier from a distance as you sneak around? Or do you leave at night, when you'll blend right into the shadows, but won't be able to see anything for yourself?
Here you go.
You could buy a flashlight, but if you aren't careful, you might draw the wrong kind of attention. I had no idea there were anything other than lizard people in this game, and spotting this freak running towards me legitimately scared me. After desperately scouring the scrap depot area mentioned in the mission text, I ended up having to look up what the hell these radio jammers look like. Once you know what to look for, it's not super hard to find, but I do think a simple description in the mission text like, "it glows red and beeps," would be helpful wouldn't be overly handholdy, and would be something that your employer would be feasibly willing to divulge to you. This was a tough one that took some time to clamber over the obtusity and difficulty hurdle, but once I did, I was pretty hooked. Exploring this world, making small but life or death decisions at seemingly every turn was enthralling, and I can see myself spending a lot of time in this hostile world when Project Silverfish hits its to-be-announced release date. This list has been a bit heavy up to this point, so let's dive into something a little lighter. Skogdal, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is a deck-building game set in the 1990s about a strange occurrence one night in the small titular Norwegian town of Skogdal. The 1990s setting extends to the art style as well, which feels like a pencil-drawn version of a cartoon that would have aired on MTV at the time. It's really great. Each scene is full of detail, and I love taking some time to spot all the little goofs and references every time I entered a new area. It feels like games with this much focus on their unique art style can often be somewhat lacking in the gameplay department. But Skogdal is a surprisingly fun, clever, and funny deck builder. You begin the game by choosing from a selection of attacks and/or utility cards that are straightforward enough, but you also get to choose one of your best buds to join you. I'm pretty Balatro-pilled this year, so I went with Card Gamer. As you traverse Skogdal, you'll enter these static scenes where you can click around and do your typical deck buildery stuff. Add or remove cards, receive random buffs or debuffs, or a bit later, combine your cards together. The card art here is stylish, creative, and usually goofy enough to get at least a chuckle out of me. Eventually someone on screen will attack you, and if you've played Slay the Spire or any of its ilk, you'll have no trouble figuring out the early stages. The main twist comes in the form of followers, who often offer you build-changing but limited use abilities, and who can be sacrificed when their usefulness to you dries up. There's nothing here that's going to shake up the deck builder genre in any huge way, but the extremely strong style definitely carries the pretty good substance pretty far here. Also, the music owns. I do wonder how or if the light story elements will play out, and whether this concept can carry a full game. But if you do think it looks cool, definitely give it a try or wishlist it for when it comes out in full sometime next year. If seeing spaces like this, or this, or this give you intense I want to live there feelings, then I think you'll love Straftat, the new 1v1 competitive FPS from the Mohrta brothers, developers of the brutalist architecture exploration game Bobdi. At a glance, the move from Bobdi to a fast-paced first-person shooter seems strange, but I think these two games share the same soul. The first half of that soul is an obvious one, the aesthetic. Like Bobdi, Straftat is a strangely ethereal game, with dreamlike depictions of brutalist architecture that I find absolutely stunning in a way that someone smarter than me would probably be better off explaining, but to put it simply, it owns. If you enter the training room before a match, you can actually just explore the vast space freely, which I did for quite some time. The second half of the shared soul between Bobdi and Straftat is a willingness to let you push the boundaries of what some more cowardly games might call game-breaking mechanics to the absolute tipping point. Straftat is fast, chaotic, and frantic. Each game plays out in a best-of-5 style set of rounds, changing maps each round. Unlike most games, each map in Straftat feels less like new scenery to play with the same equipment in, and more like an entirely new game unto itself. Some are relatively straightforward, like this map that looks and feels like something out of Call of Duty, with relatively standard modern guns and some grenades. Or this rifles-only map that harkens back to Counter-Strike's Scouts Knives or Op training maps. But others are nigh inscrutable, like this ice slope that pushes players and weapons ever downward until reaching the bottom where you teleport back to the top, only to fall down and repeat back and forth until one of you dies. Or this Twin Peaks-ass map where you chase each other through curtains like scrunkly low-poly versions of Dale Cooper and Bob. The wildest thing, though, is that all of this chaos somehow comes together in a way that, against all odds, feels fun and fair. You start each round with nothing in hand, and both players, sometimes right in front of each other, have to scramble to find a weapon before the other. Of course, this is Straftat, so finding a weapon doesn't even mean you'll understand how to use it. There's no extra ammo or reloading to worry about, so fights often end up in this hilarious stalemate where you both empty your clip into each other, but have to throw your weapons to the ground and scramble away in search of more. This is easily the most viscerally fun demo I played in this Next Fest, and if you have any affinity at all for FPS games, I highly recommend checking it out. The full game actually comes out next week if you're watching this while it's new, so check it out and come beat my butt in the back rooms if you want to. I hope you found something new here to enjoy. It was very difficult to narrow things down in this Next Fest, and there were a bunch of games that I really wanted to talk about, but making these videos in the span of a week is tough. So I'll show some demos here that I enjoyed or thought were interesting if you want some more suggestions. If you found anything cool yourself, definitely let me know in the comments. I've got a couple more regular videos in the oven that should be coming relatively soon, so until then, have a good one. Bye!